Yeah, it's getting hotter, all right. The problem's that there's not enough average Joes running our country. You know, you don't get to be a big shot anymore unless you're already a big shot. And those folks have no idea what it's like to live like we do. You know, middle class is a pink slip away from being poor. And being poor is one illness away from living in your car with your family. Then you have these fat cat politicians who don't have a clue what's going on. Like this mayor who says, we can't give food to the homeless since they need to be protected. So he only wants licensed contractors hired by the government to provide food, while as citizens and restaurants have to throw away food that's maybe a little bruised but not used. Makes you wonder whether people like him are uncaring or just have never had an idea what it's like to be hungry. Unless, of course, they got a friend who just happens to be a licensed food contractor willing to work for the government. But you know, even with stuff like that happening, I didn't agree with those folks who said government was uncaring and maybe inherently evil. I guess I kind of believe it just gets that way over time. Like we've been saying, we tend to somehow lose control little by little. And you know, it was a while back when I started realizing how much out of control it could become if we don't know what's going on. And we don't. It was when I was in business, when I helped start a group called Project Share to feed the homeless. My restaurant began in a church basement twice a week to help folks out who were looking for a meal. Then other restaurants helped us until we got every night covered and even lunches. And we did it all privately, no government help. And we were pretty successful, serving hundreds of people every day. We made lasagna that volunteers from our restaurant cooked and served. And what made it really neat was it was like a restaurant. We thanked people for coming, and we told them we hope to see them again soon. It was cool. It was like an actual restaurant. And everybody felt good at the end of every service. And yet, since it was kind of a gathering place for so many folks in need, I got volunteers from a local hospital to offer exams. And then other groups showed up that supplied clothing and job offers. Got to be a one-stop shop. But one area we always had problems with from the very beginning was shelters for families with people, with kids and whatever, who was sleeping in their cars. And we found out about a family like that. We helped. We kind of all chipped in. The restaurants chipped in and got them a motel room. Of course, then we would be approached by more desperate families who heard we were helping. And we had no idea there was so many people in need. So I called the federal housing hotline that we heard about was offering shelter for families to see if they could help us. But I could never get through to speak to anyone. So I left message after message, explained how we were involved in Project Share, a homeless feeding project, and we're paying for motel rooms for families without a place to sleep, and how demand was going up, and we just needed some help. We just needed a little bit of help with the housing part. But there was never a call back. And I knew I had the right number because they had a message thanking me for calling and saying they'd get back to me. Finally, after weeks of trying and then searching and pestering those elected folks who should at least know where our federal dollars were located, I found out where their downtown address was. So I walk into the lobby of this old historic government building, but I couldn't find its listing. Then I go from office to office until I find a receptionist at another agency who thought they were up in an unmarked office on the second floor. Now, as I'm walking into this large office, I notice at least 15 to 20 people sitting and standing around smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee as the phones rang. I asked around and found the supervisor, and I tell him how for weeks I was trying to get through to his office, since I had families that were desperate for a place to stay. And we were trying to do the best we could. He tells me that this department had run out of money for housing a while back, and they were making a list of the messages asking for help. And they were going to respond and call people back as soon as the money started coming in again. So I asked him how he's able to pay all this staff that's standing around. And he says that in the beginning there were just a few, but as demand for housing for homeless families increased, more people got hired. Then money started to become tight as the program expanded to include more people with different needs until they couldn't provide for any emergency housing funds anymore. Yeah, it went beyond just providing for families with kids sleeping in the back of their car to go to other programs. And then some money was siphoned off as one of the added programs got transferred somewhere else. He said it sounded like politics was involved. I mean, of course politics was involved. Can you believe it? So when I asked if he thought about cutting employees so he'd have enough money for housing for these desperate people again, he said policy didn't allow that. Didn't allow it to happen. That it was the government policy said you can't do that sort of thing. And what added to the problem was that employees over time received raises and benefits that ate into the decreasing funds. I almost had a laugh. Okay, so what we got here is the government starting a good new program, spending our taxpayer money, helping those in desperate need. But when it came time to choose between its original purpose and the bureaucracy, well, bureaucracy won out. I told him it reminded me of a plastic container of milk that provided nutrition as long as the milk lasted. But the container could live forever, even when it disappears in a landfill. Anyway, even after that, I still didn't think government was evil because it doesn't plan on bringing harm to people. But I think the evil surfaces when it makes the choice to ignore the desperate people it's supposed to serve. Instead, it feeds its, I guess you'd call it what, gluttony? Then purposely brings harm to those who it's supposed to care for. Because at that point, they don't care. They're in it to get and keep a job. And if there's a way, make more money for themselves. You see, if that supervisor would have complained to higher-ups that there was nothing for them to do as long as there was no money available for housing, he and all the people he was supervising would have been out of their cushy jobs. And then his supervisor wouldn't have anybody to supervise, and he'd be gone. And then the elimination of jobs would continue until they were all back where they started, when someone realized that there were families living in their cars. You see, all these people at some point probably rationalized that if they made any noise to try and get this housing deal back on track, that they might not only lose their jobs, but they could also be an illness away from living in their cars. So I guess they figured all they had to do is accept the budget decreases, smoke cigarettes, drink coffee, and enjoy themselves while they can, or as long as the landfill stays open. In other words, lie low, don't identify where you're located, and offer a nice phone message that lets people know you're busy, but that you care. And get back to them as soon as you can take care of everyone else in line ahead of them. And just as long as no one higher up questions where the money was going, or tells their supervisor that no one is getting served, at least everyone will keep their jobs. Of course, everybody knows what's going on, but hey, listen, don't broadcast it and you'll keep your job. You have to wonder whether they put as much effort into what their original job description was. Of course, now with all the stuff we read about, we can see that this stuff was just small potatoes back then. You see, it's how stuff like this GSA, IRS, and energy scandal starts, with them spending millions at conferences in Vegas having fun. Spend as much as they can of money that's there for operations, which include training as to what to do and say to all those folks in line waiting for housing, while it's still there to spend. As more average Joes are tucking their kids in at night in the back seat of a car. And how did the heads of the GSA and IRS respond when Congress asked them how they could let something like this happen? They took the fifth. Are you kidding me? They didn't want to incriminate themselves by telling the truth of how they spent money that could have been spent keeping people from having to live in their cars or be out in the street going hungry. They became so desensitized to how other people are struggling that they didn't care that the money they were wasting actually caused another human being to have no place to sleep or no food to eat. You know, I'm sure there are thousands of deals like it, and probably billions and billions wasted. So when you hear these congressmen screaming about how they have to cut entitlements to balance the budget, we need to tell them to start with the waste and corruption that the government seems to think it's entitled to. And maybe even start with all the money and perks that Congress and their staff seem to think that they're not only entitled to, but never even mention as the first place to look before looking at all those less fortunate or us to find ways to cut budgets, making it look like they really do care about how they spend our money. Never ever have they ever mentioned taking a hit themselves. To them, the role of government is to spend our money providing jobs, many times in programs that have no reason to exist or have gone beyond their reason to exist. I mean, come on. We're talking about families struggling to survive while the government's throwing our money down a rat hole that we as taxpayers intended to help some pretty desperate folks continue to exist from one day to the next, just trying to make it to the next morning with kids asleep in the back seat. You know, maybe it is inherently evil.